All right, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Again, I'm Johnathan Woodward, the AMTA Tabulation Director, and I'd like to welcome you to this event where we'll explain a little bit more and answer your questions about the new pairing system for the opening round championship series, which we of course call ORCS. So welcome, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, AMTA All-American former competitor and former AMTA coach, Justin Bernstein. How are you doing, Justin?
I'm doing great, Jonathan. Nice to see you two across the country. I'm really excited to get to talk to everybody about our new pairing system.
So I think the best place we start is a very common question that was asked is, why are we doing this? Why are we making this change? And I know that you have some background information you'd like to share that will answer those sorts of questions.
Yeah, so what I'm gonna do in a moment is put up the PowerPoint that everybody should be able to see that's really similar to what I showed the board this summer, this past summer. The pairing system is something I'd had in mind for a while. And in looking at some recent ORCS results, it occurred to me that it was time to share it with the board and see if it got any traction. But I knew that it was something really different than what we'd done in the past. So I wanted to present it in a way that people can understand what we'd be doing, why we'd be doing it. And so we passed it this summer and we're implementing it now. So I've just modified that presentation slightly, given the fact that now we have more information about how it's going to be implemented and so forth. So let me pull that up on our screen. Okay. Jonathan, is that clear? Can you see it on your screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So we're going to look at three things. First, why do we make the change? What's the impetus behind it? I'm going to be talking about that. Jonathan's going to explain how it's going to be implemented from a tabulation side. And then at the end, we're going to address some community questions. We've got more than 50 questions from the community coaches, competitors, former competitors. And so we'll go through some of the most common of those. So I think that it might make sense to start to understand the system with an example that illustrates why I think we need the system. So this is the top of the standings from the Geneva ORC last year. So at the end of the competition, these are the teams with winning records. And you can see them in order. Now this is a competition where there were 5 bids to be allocated. And the way we allocate those bids is we say who had the best record. And so we go, okay, the team, let's see if I can make PowerPoint work. Why is it not going to the next page? Excuse me. There we go. Okay, so you can see that the top 2 teams here, Ohio State, they had the only 7 win records. So immediately we give them the first 2 bids. But there's 3 more bids to assign, and there's 4 teams with 6 wins. So we have to look at CS. And so when we look at the CS, we say, okay, there's 3 teams with higher CS in the 4th. And so the last spot goes to Stanford 1040, and Stanford 1039 is the last one out. So that's how we do it. We never even go further than that. We don't look down to the 5 and 3 teams, even though we really should. Because when we take a look at Wheaton 1016 with 5 wins, they're a pretty good example of the problems with our previous pairing system. To the right of your screen, you'll see a list of all of the teams of the competition based on their TPR. That's the team power ranking, how they've done over the last 3 years. We'll talk more in a little bit about why the team power ranking is a pretty predictive indicator of how teams are going to do. But when we look at Wheaton A, these are the teams that they faced. In other words, they faced just about as hard a schedule as they could have faced, and they still earned a 5 and 3 record. And I think a good pairing system would do 2 things. It would say, hey, we shouldn't be forcing one school to face 4 of the top 7 ranked teams based on previous results. That seems unfair. It's also problematic that they did really well against those teams. If you have a winning record against the teams that are essentially the top contenders to go to nationals, or the ones that have been going to nationals, in this case, many of the ones who are then going to nationals, and you have a winning record, the system ought to reward that. But in our case here, it never even reaches them in a tiebreaker. So it's not even that they lost the tiebreaker on CS. We don't even look at their CS because they didn't have enough wins. And the problem there is that our system treats all wins as equal. And in a sense, we sort of have to, but we don't do a good enough job, or at least I think historically, of recognizing that our system puts teams in really different situations with respect to schedules. Our entire system of determining winners and who advances was based first on ballots won. But that only works if the teams are facing schedules of equal difficulty. If you look at almost any sports system, whether it's the NBA, the NFL, and so forth, the whole idea of scheduling is to try to give teams roughly equal schedules. You face teams within your division, and if you're comparing the teams in the division, you try to give them roughly the same schedule outside of their division. In our system, historically, it's not that it did a bad job of equalizing strength of schedule, it didn't try to equalize strength of schedule. So I was trying to think about ways that we might do that, and that's where this came in. So I'll give you some examples. Here's why it really matters to try to equalize strength of schedule. If you looked at last year's ORCS, and you looked at how many top 6 TPR opponents each team faced, we see that some teams faced much harder schedules than others. So for example, about a third of all teams didn't have to face a single top 6 TPR opponent. In other words, you've got 24 teams at the ORC, the top 6 teams represent the top quartile of the field based on past performance. And so we see a third of the teams aren't facing any top 6 TPR opponents. The average is 1, but we also see a lot that have 2. So a third of them face 0, and more than a fifth face 2, and some of them even have to face 3. So we're talking about wildly different schedules in terms of difficulty. And we can see that really makes a difference, because if you have to face one school in the top 6, your chances of advancing are 24%. And if you have to face 2, it's just over 16%. That's an enormous difference. It's about 50% more relative one to the other. So it's easy to say, well, you should beat the teams in front of you, the best teams get it done. And that may be true, but schedule makes a big difference. You can see here that simply who you face, some of which is outside of your control, makes a huge difference in terms of who advances. And that seems problematic. We can also see that the chance of advancing based on the number of top 6 teams you face skyrockets when we don't face any top 6 teams. Here, more than 60% of teams that don't have to face a top 6 team advance. So we have huge differences in results. If you have a harder schedule, you have a much lower chance of reaching nationals. And in fact, in some ways, this problem is even worse than it looks, because remember, in our high pairing system, you should be doing well if you're facing really good teams. In other words, if you win, you're likely to continue to face more and more good teams. And so in some ways, we would expect facing a bunch of good teams or high-ranked teams to be correlated with advancing. You're doing well, you keep hitting other good teams. And so the fact that hitting other good teams appears to be negatively correlated with advancement suggests that it's even worse than it looks. In other words, some of the problem is being masked by our system, and there's probably an even bigger relationship between strength of schedule and ability to advance. In other words, it's important to make sure that we give teams an equal opportunity to face equal opponents. So the new system, which Jonathan's going to talk about in more detail, and then I'll explain some of the answers to the questions that you've sent. This is the motion that the board passed at the summer board meeting. This applies only at ORCS. And the reason it applies only at ORCS, somebody asked that question, why not regionals? For a couple reasons, but chiefly the system only works when there's an exact multiple of 8 teams. So you could do it with 8 teams, 16, 24, 32, et cetera. We don't have equal sized regionals, so it wouldn't work at a regional competition. And so ORCS is the place to do it. We divide the groups into 4 based on TPR. And we'll talk more about the details of TPR, but TPR is Team Power Rankings, and it's based on your last 3 years of results at national competition and at ORCS competition, with greater weight at nationals. The teams are ranked 1 through 6, that's the group A, 7 through 12 is B, and so forth. And the key idea is that each team is going to face exactly 1 team from each of the 4 groups. So no matter what group you're in, you're going to face 1 team that's in the top 6 by TPR, 1 team in the next 6, and so on and so forth. That means that if you're going to Memphis, you can't face the top 2 ranked teams in Memphis. If you're going to Santa Monica this coming weekend, you can't face the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams going into that competition, nor can you face only a slate of the schools who are ranked 19 through 24. Every single team will face one team from each group. So this was the slide I showed you a moment ago of what our current model produced last year. We see a really wide gulf in the number of top 6 TPR opponents that each ORCS team faces. This is what the new model will do. Every single team would face exactly one, no more, no less, of those top 6 teams. And if we did the same graphs, of course, for group 7 through 12 or 13 through 18, et cetera, we'd see the same thing, right? We see disparate results for the current model, or the old model, I should say, and the current model that we've adopted this year would show that everybody faces an equal number from each group, exactly one. And that says current model and proposed model because of the slide I used at the board meeting before it passed. Okay, so I'm going to take us off the slides for a moment and turn it back over to Johnathan, and he'll talk about how this is going to work from a tabulation perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So hopefully most folks who are on the presentation watching us have seen the list of group designations. It's posted on the AMTA website. If you go to the ORCS page on the AMTA website, click on the earned bid list. There is a link just above the earned bid list where you can see sort of a spreadsheet of the group designations for each and every ORCS, where we have that broken down into those A, B, C, and D groups based on the team power ranking at each site. So the first thing that's very important and that the AMTA reps at your tournament are going to be confirming with you when you go to check into your site is they need to make sure that, especially if your school has 2 teams, that you have accurately identified your A and your B team, and that your A team has to use your lower team number. So we can't have anything where people are using, the B team number for the A team or anything like that. The A team always has to have the lowest team number if you do in fact have the 2 teams. What's going to happen next at the opening round draws, there's going to be a coin flip before the reps will actually do that random draw. That coin flip is going to decide everyone's side assignments for round 1 and by extension for round 2. So if that coin flip comes up heads, everyone in the A group and the B group is going to be the prosecution in round 1, while everyone in the C group and the D group is going to be the defense in round 1. And if the coin flip comes up tails, it's going to be just the reverse. The C and the D groups will be prosecution in round 1, and the A and B groups will be defense in round 1. So after the coin flip gets done, then there's going to be the random draw of the pairings for round 1. And in round 1, again, it's the A group facing the D group and the B group facing the C group. So those cards are going to be drawn in the order that corresponds to how the coin flip came out. So for example, if the coin flip was tails, when you get to the D versus A matchup, D card is going to be drawn randomly. That card will be prosecution, and A card will be drawn. That card will be defense, and that's your very first pairing. So again, even though the spreadsheet shows that the teams are ranked, that's really more just for ease of reference so that everyone can see what the various rankings are. It is not seeded, so A1 isn't automatically going to face D1. A1 isn't automatically going to face D6. It is a completely random draw within those group assignments for the round 1 draw. But again, everyone is going to be on the same side of the case in a single group. So if that coin flip comes up heads, everyone in the A group is going to be prosecution in round 1, and therefore everyone in the A group is going to be defense in round 2. So those groups are side constrained for the first 2 rounds. The ranking system for all of the subsequent pairings is the same as it was in the previous systems. We first look to ballots 1. After round 1, we look next to point differential, and after rounds 2 and 3, we look at combined strength after we look at ballots 1. So the factors that go into how teams are ranked for those high pairings are unchanged from previous systems, except now we're ranking the teams within the different groups as opposed to across the tournament as a whole or across all teams that need a particular side of the case. So for example, after round 1 is done, all of the results are in. Everyone in the B group is going to be ranked B1 through B6. Everyone in the C group is going to be ranked C1 through C6. And then the pairings in round 2 are going to be the A group facing the C group, the B group facing the D group. So it will be A1 versus C1, B1 versus D1, so on and so forth. Impermissible matches are going to be much less, I think, than they were in the previous systems, just because it's going to be impossible in this system to have a prior meeting impermissible, since you can only face each group once. Once you faced a group, you can't face any of your prior opponents again. And just from looking at the group designations, you can see when it would even be theoretically possible to have a same school match, depending on whatever round a school's A team and a B team could possibly match up in. That's the only round that could possibly be an impermissible match. And because we have the 2-team limit, there will never be a situation where a bracket is not able to be resolved. Everything will always be able to be resolved within the brackets. So the impermissibles are going to be resolved the same as always, except they're always going to be resolved within a group. So a team in the B group is never going to be swapped with a team in the A group in order to resolve an impermissible. Those are always going to be resolved within the particular group designations. Then round 3 is going to be the intra-group round. The cards are going to lay out almost exactly how they're currently laid out. It's not side constrained. The top will be 1 versus 2. The next will be 4 versus 3, sort of in that snake pattern, so that the highest ranked teams aren't all on the same side of the case. And then finally, round 4 is again a side constrained round. So there's going to be 4 separate groups of pairings. Even though it's A versus B and C versus D, there's going to be one group of A teams that need prosecution versus B groups that need defense. And then the other group will be the B teams that need prosecution versus the A teams that need defense. And then the same thing with those 2 separate groups for the C and the D facing each other, again, depending on the side constraints there. Then when you get to the very end of the tournament, the group designations are no longer in play. Whether you're in Group A, Group B, C, or D, that has no bearing on whether or not you're going to win a bid. It's not a tiebreaker. We're looking, as always, at ballots won, the head-to-head tiebreaker if it would come into play, and then combined strength and opponents' combined strength. One of the benefits to the system, I think, is that combined strength is actually going to be a little bit more meaningful number than it was in the past. It was always meaningful insofar as it told us how many ballots your opponents have won. But now we know that all of your opponents have also had a generally equal strength of schedule, while in the previous system, we didn't know that. So combined strength, I think, is going to be an even better tiebreaker than it already was under the system. So that's the long and short of how the 4 rounds are going to play out.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the questions that people sent in. We had, and I'm calling these objections, but I turned the questions and comments into categories. We got more than 50 comments and another 60 questions from the community. We appreciate those. And we also got a lot of comments saying, here are the things that people like. I'm not going to focus as much on things that people like, because I do want to focus on addressing concerns. I think my overarching comment, and of course I'm biased because I was the one who suggested the motion in the first place, but I guess my overarching comment would be, if you look at the model and you look at the system and say, this is imperfect, I agree with you. I think that when it comes to choosing pairing systems, perfection isn't an option. The fact is, we at an ORC are looking at 24 teams trying to find the best 6, and they only have 4 rounds. In an ideal world, you'd play every single team, you'd have 100 judges in each round, there'd be tons of data, and we do nothing but mock trial. That sounds pretty fun. We don't have the luxury of more than 4 trials. We don't have the luxury of 100 judges around. And so with the limited data we have, what's the best way to do it? Or maybe the better way of thinking about it is, what's the least bad way of doing it? And I think that what the system does, before I get into the specifics, is it removes a bunch of possible schedules that your team might face that are not fair. You can't face the 2 top-ranked teams in the competition based on historical results. A team can't get to nationals without facing at least one of teams that have historically done very well in AMTA. You can't get to nationals without facing 2 of the top 12 in the competition, and so forth. But like anything else, the system does have drawbacks. It has questions. I know a lot of you have questions. So I'm going to take those, starting with the first. Some people say, well, why isn't CS enough? Why don't we just look at combined strength? Isn't that the tiebreaker that we should use when evaluating somebody's schedule. Why do we need to equalize the schedule? Let's just see how many wins everyone gets. And then after that, we can use CS as a tiebreaker. And I think the answer is no, CS is not enough. And Wheaton's a good example of that because CS only comes into play as a tiebreaker. If two teams have drastically different schedules, and as a result, they get even slightly different number of wins, AMTA never looks at their CS as a comparison between the two. And we can think of tons of analogies, of course, why this might be problematic. If you're facing only top opponents and your opponents are facing lower opponents, we can think of sports analogies. If I were facing, of course, 7-year-olds in basketball, I'd probably do very well. If I were facing NBA players, I would have a much lower record. You can't compare apples to oranges. And so we want a number that is more meaningful when we're comparing records. So next objection we got, and we got this a lot, is that TPR is not effective. The team power rankings based on the last 3 years of results aren't an effective way of ranking teams to try to identify who's going to be the strongest at this particular competition. And I think the chief argument against them is the rosters change from year to year. And that's absolutely true. The reason we don't just crown the national champion from one year automatically make them the national champion for the next year is you got to play the games. And of course, people graduate, people improve, all sorts of things allow teams to get better. But just because the TPR doesn't fully capture this year's team from, and I'll use my alma mater, from UC Berkeley, that doesn't mean that it's meaningless. It's still a better predictor than randomness, which is what we've used historically. And actually, if you dig into the numbers, TPR is a lot better than random. TPR is really, really good at predicting how teams are going to do. These are last year's results. For teams ranked 1 through 6 entering ORCS in TPR, they advanced almost half the time to nationals. But when you go down to teams 7 through 12, that is just one quartile down, that number gets cut in half, and then it's cut even less than half, and even less than half after that. In other words, even when we had a system that didn't in any way take into account teams' historical performance explained a great deal of the results and outcomes. So while I think we can improve TPR, and I'll talk about that in a moment, TPR has been extraordinarily powerful in predicting results. For those who think we can improve TPR, I agree. And I think we probably will tweak the system as we move forward. Without getting too far into the weeds of why we're not using regional results this year, the short answer is I think we want to make sure that the system works, that it can be implemented, and the idea would be each year we're using any system, whether it's tabulation or case writing or case balance. The idea is to keep learning and improving. But to give you an idea of why we didn't think it was crucial to use regionals results the first year, I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, regionals results are going to be inherently compressed. If you're looking at teams that advance to ORCS, you're only looking at the teams that earn good records at regionals in the first place. If you had a record of less than 5, you weren't advancing, period. So it's not like the records range from 8 to 0, they're ranging from 8 to 5. So we're not talking about a huge bandwidth difference in what those regionals numbers would look like. Regionals numbers are also not based on a competition designed to have high every round. In other words, the records of teams may be distorted by the fact that we high-low in round 4, which again reduces the value of the regionals results. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't improve things. In fact, I suspect they would, but that's an example of why we're not using them this year as we implement the model. I think the next argument against the system that we received is that TPR is unfair. It's not fair to consider what teams have done historically when you're trying to build the pairing system for the current year. And I guess we'll talk about whether there's an advantage to being in one group or the other group in a moment, but I think the idea of using TPR in the first place, it's something that we already do. In fact, it's something we've always done. Every one of our ORCs has a goal of trying to power balance the ORCs, to try to power balance the regions. There's a reason why we don't take last year's top 10 and stick them all in one ORC. That wouldn't be fair to the teams in that ORC, and it would make things too easy probably for the teams in the other ORCs. So at every level, AMTA is trying to make sure that we balance things based on past performance. We see that at regionals, where we are putting teams in certain regions based on past results. ORCs, the same thing. When we make the regionals, we're anticipating where they're going to go for ORCs. And even nationals, when we draw divisions, it's based on TPR, how teams have done over the last 3 years. So we've already been doing this. But I'm not going to just defend it on the idea that we've done it. I think it's a good idea. And for all of the arguments that make sense, that of course TPR doesn't capture how teams are doing this year, and it doesn't capture the fact that some people graduate and that some people improve, I think every single team, given the choice of having their 4 ORCS opponents drawn all from Group A or all from Group D, in other words, you can choose 4 teams that historically reach nationals or 4 teams that rarely have. I think most teams trying to maximize their chances of advancement would say, I probably don't want to face all 4 teams that historically reach nationals just about every year. The question is, once we recognize that there's a relationship between past success and future performance, how do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that doesn't advantage or disadvantage any particular group of teams? And so that was by far the most common question that was raised. And I'd say it was split about evenly. We got a lot of people who wrote in and said, well, this seems like it really advantages top teams because they only have to face one other group team in the top 6. And the order in which they play them may advantage them because on day 1, they only have to face teams that were in the C and D groups, that is the bottom half of the field based on historical results. And they could be 4-0 by the time they have to face anybody who historically has been reaching nationals consistently. At the same time, we also heard concerns, people saying the opposite, saying that it's not fair that top teams have to hit each other, they knock each other out. And I got a lot of examples of students saying, hey, I was on a team last year, we were really good, and we were high ranked. We faced another high ranked team, and it wasn't fair that one of those teams had to lose. And I guess what I'd say is that no matter your group, you're going to face exactly one team from each group. That seems like a just result for everybody. I don't think that top teams, that your A group teams are somehow exempt from facing other A group teams. I don't think they're entitled to an easier schedule simply because they've done very well in the past. Nor do I think that our teams that haven't done as well should get to avoid facing top groups either. The fact is everybody has to face one from A, from B, from C, from D. Now, to the extent that those groups aren't perfect because TPR isn't perfect, that's true. There's surely going to be some team this year that is much better than its TPR ranking. And what that means is that whoever faces them is going to be facing a tougher Group C or Group D team than some of their peers will. That's true. But that's always been the case. It's always been the case that we've had some uneven schedules. This is just reducing, hopefully, the problem of uneven schedules. I'd say that the only potential structural reason to think that this might favor either top teams, your A group, your B group versus C or D groups, is the order in which you face those groups. When I've modeled this in the past, I've not found any difference in outcome based on the order in which the groups face each other. I got an email today saying, hey, there's reason to think otherwise. We're going to look at every information we get based on the results we see versus anything that people send us. We want to make the system as good as possible. But we think that regardless, this is an improvement over previous systems that didn't give any credence to how teams have done in the past. You could face, like Wheaton did, an outsized difficult schedule. And the last comment that we got is that this is going to create a lot more 6 and T teams without bids. I don't think that's going to be the case. I guess we'll find out. It's hard to know exactly what judges are going to do. 2 people wrote to me and said, well, if everybody wins based on their TPR, then you're going to have 3 8-0s, you'll have this number of 6 and 2s and so forth. But we all know that's not how this works. Some level of mock trial, of course, is subjective. Judges disagree. You're going to see splits. Not every round is going to be decided based on who's favored in TPR. Not every round is going to be an A team victory over a B team victory and so forth. So we'll see when it comes to the number of 6 and 2 teams without bids. I guess I would say 2 things. Number one, 6 and 2 may mean something different at a competition where the schedules are more equalized than it meant at competitions in the past. So I don't want to anticipate what their outcome will be. But it also seems like where you have 6 bids at each org, we hopefully won't see too many teams at 6 and 2 not advancing. And of course, there's no magic number that guarantees a team ought to advance or ought not advance, whether it's 7 and 1, 6 and 2, or 5 and 3. But I think the reason people are sensitive about 6 and 2, understandably, is that if you're 6 and 2, it means one round, one opponent can knock you out, and that's tough to bear. So we will be monitoring that, but I don't anticipate any more 6 and 2s without bids than we've seen historically. So these are questions for Johnathan that are more tabulation based. So we compiled those. He's going to be talking us through those.
Yeah, so the first question we have here is really, again, talking about TPR. Some teams have expressed concern of, will this system make it harder if we are lower in TPR ranking currently, or maybe, we haven't been to ORCS before, so we don't have any TPR ranking right now. Is that going to make it harder for us to climb the ladder and increase our TPR? And I think the answer to that is no. In this system, it's simply ensuring that everyone is going to face roughly equal strength of schedule. And what determines TPR really has nothing to do with the skill of the teams that you face. It's how many ballots you win. So if you come into ORCS and you win 3 ballots, 4 ballots, 5 ballots, you're going to have TPR next year, and you're going to move up in the TPR rankings no matter what. So really, I think the only sort of theoretical case where it would hurt is if you were a team that somehow could only win ballots at ORCS if you were facing other bad teams. And I think at ORCS that usually doesn't happen, where you have those sort of pairings. But it's not going to make it any harder for teams that don't have TPR or haven't had success in the past to necessarily win ballots this year. So if you're new to ORCS, you're going to improve by definition in TPR this next year. The next question is, how did we come upon the order that groups were going to face each other? And this was something that the Tabulation Advisory Committee spent a significant amount of time discussing, trying to figure out what the best solution would be. We definitely wanted the groups of like strength. In other words, the intra-group round as well as the adjacent group round. So the A versus the B and the C versus D to be later on in the tournament, because we wanted some more data from rounds 1 and 2 to be able to more accurately pair those rounds. And I think one of the things we're going to look as we look at the results from the ORCS this year is decide in the future whether we think any changes need to be made to that. But I think we thought in general it was best for the top teams to face the bottom teams earlier in the competition, so that if there were teams in those C and D groups that perhaps are punching above their weight, that TPR is for whatever reason, sort of under accounting for, that we would be able to have some data so that when it comes time to match those teams against the top group teams, that those would be a more meaningful power pairing later on in the tournament. The next question is, can B teams elect to use their A team's TPR for the sake of calculating groupings? And it's unclear from the question whether this question is referring to a school with a single team that is competing at ORCS or a school with 2 teams that's competing at ORCS. So I'll address both of those scenarios in turn. If you have only one school competing at ORCS, by definition, AMTA considers that to be your A team, because that's the team from your school that has done the best this year. And just like in past years, however that team does at ORCS, that is going to be your A team's TPR going forward, because that's the only team that you had competing at ORCS. So whether your program internally decides, for example, let's say your A team didn't get out of regionals, but your B team did, and your program decides that you're going to send the B team to ORCS because they're the ones that won the bid, that's perfectly fine. You can do that. From AMTA's perspective, that's still the best team from your school, so you become the A team in our eyes. The second version of that is if your school has 2 teams, you have both an A team and a B team at ORCS, then no, your A team needs to be competing with the lower team number in whatever group the A team is assigned in. Your second best team needs to be in the group where the B team is assigned, and it would be assigned with the TPR of your B team, as shown on the group designations list on the website. We certainly can't have any situations where teams are flip-flopping, putting their A team in a bottom bracket, putting their B team in a higher bracket. It's up to you as the schools to make a good faith determination in terms of which of your teams you believe is subjectively better and your A team, just like we have always done with regional team assignments, with championship designations. So there's really nothing different about teams having to honestly set forth which is your A and which is your B. The next question is, how would the groupings work if an ORCS had more than 6 teams with no TPR rank? And you can obviously look at the group designations spreadsheet this year and see that at most there are 3 unranked teams in the D group at any site. So we haven't had to cross that bridge this year, but the tiebreaker is always regional results. So we would look at the number of regional wins and regional CS as the tiebreaker. So that's what we would do if there was any sort of a tie that was group determinative. And the final question is, why is round 4 paired high-high instead of high-low? That's a very good question, a very common question. And I think the best answer to that is, in this system, because we are looking to equalize strength of schedule and see how the best teams in each group face against each other, we're already sort of putting our thumb on the scale, so to speak. We are making it so that these have to be even. There really isn't any power to protect in those 4th round pairings. If there are 2 teams at 5-1, for example, or 4-2, we want to know between the 2 of them, if they're in groups that are facing each other, which is the more deserving of advancing. And the best way to determine that is for those 2 5-1 teams or those 2 4-2 teams to face each other in the trial, and the result of that trial will tell us who gets to advance. If you do a high-low pairing where a team at 5-1 gets to face a team at 3-3 or potentially even less, it's not like the prior system where it's modified power protect, where you're trying to get to those teams in the middle. With the way that these groups are structured, there really is no middle that you're trying to get to. So the only fair way of getting those pairings to accurately show us which team should get to advance is to have the best teams face each other. Mr. Bernstein, I believe you are on mute.
You're right. I was on mute. Thank you. One other comment that we got that I think is worth sharing. We got people saying they had questions about how the system worked mechanically, about its rationale. We had people writing in saying they thought it favored teams at the top of the TPR, teams at the lower end. We had a lot of people writing in saying, hey, they feel more confident going to ORCS because they feel like they're going to get a fair shake. They won't have to face the top 2 ranked teams in the competition. But the one comment that we got that I thought was really a great observation, and it's tough to argue with, one person wrote simply the entire message, ORCS are hard. And they are. We're happy to answer other questions, but if nothing else, we wish everybody really good luck at the opening round championship series. All right.
I'm just taking a look at the chat. I don't see any more questions we haven't addressed. If anyone wants to pop any additional questions in the chat box, you're welcome to do so. So we'll hold it open for another minute or so just to see if anyone has any questions that they want to put in the chat for those of you watching from your computer.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah. So the question that was just sent through is, what built-in measures are there if teams drop midway through? And that's always, something that is difficult to deal with at any tournament, in any pairing system. So hopefully, historically, that is not likely to happen at ORCS. It's more likely the teams drop out of regional tournaments. Generally speaking, it's teams that leave after round 3, and more often than not, it's teams that are not doing particularly well that leave after round 3. So our hope is that there won't be any reason that a team would have to drop midway through. What we decided to do is we would basically follow the same sort of guiding principles that we've done in the past, as a buy-buster team would step into the shoes of the team that is departing, regardless of what group that team might be in. One thing we would certainly try to do is we would, to the maximum extent possible, we would try and compose that buy-buster team of other students who are competing in that same group. So the hope would be that the buy-buster team, notwithstanding the fact it's a buy-buster, might still generally accurately reflect the overall strength of that group. You don't want the buy-buster to be significantly stronger or significantly weaker than that particular group. So that's what we would do in that unfortunate circumstance.
We have a question from Sanjeev Viswan. I can't help but say he's a former gladiator. Won't round 4 side constraints impact the effects of the high-high pairing? He says, suppose you got a 6-0 prosecution team in Group B, 3-3 defense team in Group A, and that's simply because the Group A teams are restricted to prosecution in round 4.
I mean, I don't know that that's necessarily all that much different than the prior pairing system. You always run the risk that even when a case like this one is incredibly balanced on a nationwide level, you can still have cases where a case that's balanced nationwide is showing not balanced results at a single particular tournament. So this was something that could happen in the previous system where, you know, notwithstanding the fact that round 3 isn't side constrained, you could have imbalanced side results in round 3 that create imbalanced pairings in round 4. So I don't know that there's anything about this system that necessarily makes that side imbalance either better or worse. Justin, what are your thoughts?
I think, and again, I'll admit my bias, I think in some ways it's better because under our current system, and you can look at regionals as an example, suppose you think the case is imbalanced toward in favor of the defense. Well, you really want to make sure in round 3 you go defense. You better hope you go defense because not only would you get to win the round 3, but then if you do, you presumably get an easier opponent in round 4 when you're on the weaker side prosecution. Here, you don't get to double dip. If you have the advantage in one round, then you're going to have the disadvantage in the other, and both rounds are equally important because you haven't been able to avoid tougher opponents as a result of doing well.
Good question, Jeev. Thanks for joining us on the chat. We appreciate it. I'm not seeing any more questions popping up. We appreciate those of you who joined us. And oh, here's another question from our friends down in Florida. Would that mean there are only 3 possible opponents in round 4 that your team could hit? And the answer to that is yes. There might even potentially be only 2 possible opponents your team could hit, depending on if your school has 2 teams in ORCS and the groups that your 2 schools are, 2 teams are in. So depending on how that all plays out with the coin flip for sides in round 3, there are only going to be 3 possible opponents and possibly only 2 possible opponents in round 4 for your team. Excellent. Well, certainly if anyone else has any questions about the system between now and your ORCS, you are welcome to email either myself or Mr. Bernstein. You can also ask your friendly and helpful AMTA reps at your particular ORCS. They will certainly be able to answer most of your questions, and anything that they can't answer, they will probably send you on to one of us. So again, for those of you competing this coming weekend, good luck in your final preparations. Those of you competing in Geneva, I look forward to seeing you on Friday afternoon. And to everyone all across the great state of Midlands, hope you have a pleasant evening.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.